I want to welcome you all, and there it goes, oh, okay, now I'm in the dark. Okay, the thing that started this whole month-long process was this guy, Barry Van Dusen. He produced this wonderful book 4 years ago, and Mass Audubon gave copies to all of the members of the council, and I was a member of the council at that time. And so I got that book and just fell in love with it. And when the new president came in, the book was really the inspiration of Gary Clayton, who was the previous president of Mass Audubon. And when the new president came in, just before COVID, David O'Neill, why, I wrote him and I said, if you want to really orient yourself to Mass Audubon and its wonderful sanctuaries, I urge you to read this book through from cover to cover, the first thing you do. And from then on, whenever you go to visit a sanctuary, go back and read what Barry Van Dusen had to say and to depict about that sanctuary. And then you'll arrive on site with some insights and awareness of what is special about that place. I never got a response back and don't know whether my sage advice was followed, but I give it to anybody. If you want to understand the Mass Audubon sanctuaries, read the book from cover to cover, and then you can go from that to listing, put them in order of which one you want to go to next. And before you go to it, why, go back and read what he had to say about it and what he had to show about it. So it's a really wonderful thing. And we've got some of his paintings over on this side. And for those of you who've been to the earlier ones, we got the projector and the computer up and running and talking to each other before the show started rather than at the last minute. And none of the speakers has pneumonia that I know of tonight, so that I won't be a second-rate filler for Alan Poole or anybody else. And I'm just so glad that we've got Barry Van Dusen here to tell us what led up to this.
David, I'm not feeling very well.
Well, I've gone through your slideshow, and it inspired me, but I think you ought to just stick around. And other people are still coming in. And we have back in the back, there are only 2 places in the world where you can, well, there may be 3 at his house, but 2 places in the world where you can buy this book tonight. One is here, and the other is at the Drumlin Farm gift shop. And that's the only place it's available. So you can either order it by mail from there or go pick it up, or you can buy one right here. And so I urge you to do that. And we got on that wall a number of those paintings, plus 2 paintings of my brother's. My brother was an artist and an inspiration for me. He was always much more interested in nature than I was, until I got hooked on scuba diving for 10 years, and then came back and took a course with Fred Thurber, who spoke last week. And then I had the inspiration of Mike Boucher, who took us on birding trips all over the place. And we got hooked on birds. And that was in 1994. And we learned at last week's event, oh, here comes Lauren. Hi, Lauren. Lauren from Allen's Pond Sanctuary and now New Worlds. But Betty and I got hooked in 1994 and we started running around the world chasing birds. And so we went to South Africa and Alaska and Turkey and Bhutan and Korea and all over the United States. So we really enjoyed that, and it was so much a part of our lives. So anyway, welcome. I've now run on long enough. Barry is going to take you through this, and there's some free handouts back in the back of things relating to birding in this area and why this is such a special area. And the first talk that we gave was trying to make you aware of this has been a special birding area for over 150 years. And at the end of his show, Barry is going to show you a scene that links back to the first program, the first Thursday night, through the role of William Brewster. And so when he gets back to that slide, why, he'll let me have the microphone a little bit to draw the connection. But anyway, I'm going to go sit down and turn it over to him. The thing's working.
Thank you, David.
Okay. All right.
And thank you for inviting me tonight and all your hard work on this series. It's appreciated by everyone, I'm sure. So I would like to get going with the program this evening. You know, I have done, in the last 15 years or so, I've done a number of artist in residence programs around New England. And these are some of the other locations where I have done residency programs. The artist in residence can be many things. It can be a writer, it can be a fabric artist, a sculptor. When I did the residency up at the Booth Bay Botanic Gardens up in Maine, the artist in residence before me, well, I've got a little pointer here, they were building a birch bark canoe just before I arrived. So when I'm looking for places to do a residency, I'm looking for places that have a large natural area with trails. I'm a nature artist, so I want to be able to get out and work with the plants and the animals that I see there. Fruitlands Museum was a good example of that. They have a large property there. But I also get involved in some cultural depictions as well. Down at the bottom of that, anyone been to Fruitlands in Harvard, Massachusetts? Okay, you might recognize the Fruitlands farmhouse there, where Bronson Alcott, he was the father of Louisa May Alcott, had his experiment in communal living in the 1840s. I also have done residencies at several botanical gardens, and they are great places to do these programs. There's usually, of course, the cultivated garden, but then around the gardens, most of these botanical gardens have a large natural area with trails. So I could choose to work on wild subjects or work in the garden with the cultivated garden. And as anyone knows who has a garden, there's just constantly things changing in a garden with animals and birds and plants and insects constantly changing. So they're great places for these residency projects. One of the things I like the best about these residency projects is it gets me outside on a regular basis. And I have had periods of my career when I'm stuck indoors for long periods of times working on plates for a bird book or something like that, you know, with a little iron ball and a chain on my ankle. And so the residency projects allow me to get outside and work on location, which is one of the things I enjoy most about what I do for a living. So this was the original project. It was sponsored by the Museum of American Bird Art in Canton, and I worked with the director there, Amy Montague. And we sort of figured out a plan for my visiting visiting the different sanctuaries and putting together this program. As you can see, we thought we were going to get it all done in 2 years. Well, that didn't quite work out. I'll talk more about that. But we did do a blog. We had a blog during the time that I did the residency, and I wrote up each sanctuary visit afterwards on the museum blog. And then we did have an exhibit of the work at the Museum of American Bird Art in 2017. A little bit about the Mass Audubon Wildlife Sanctuaries. At the time when I started, there were 57 public wildlife sanctuaries. Now, Mass Audubon also has some properties that are not public properties, that are completely closed to the public. They're sort of wild, wilderness areas in a way. But I limited my project to just the public sanctuaries, the sanctuaries that anyone could go to and visit. So as I said, there was 57 when I started. They kept adding them while I was doing it, so I really thought maybe I'll never finish this thing, you know. Altogether, and this number is considerably higher now, but at that time, 35,000 acres were preserved in all of this complex of sanctuary systems. Some of the sanctuaries that were quite old, the Moose Hill Sanctuary was the very first one established by Mass Audubon, and they had their 100th anniversary during the time that I was doing the residency project. They vary a lot in size. The largest one is Ipswich River up in Topsfield, 12 miles of trails. So you see, you really couldn't cover the whole sanctuary in a day, whereas the smallest sanctuary, Nahant Thicket, only has a quarter mile of trails, and that was easy enough to cover in half a day or so. So I always like to ask when we start out, how many Mass Audubon sanctuaries have you visited? And everyone's visited, a show of hands, everyone's visited one, right? At least one Mass Audubon sanctuary? Okay. How about 3? Still got a lot of hands. That's great. That's great. How about half a dozen? Anyone think they've been to? Okay, good, good. This is very good. Should we jump to a dozen and see if we've got? Yeah, we got a few. Very good, very good, very good. I had been a Mass Audubon member for many, many years, but I had not visited nearly very many of the sanctuaries. So this was a real treat for me to go around the state and visit some of these sanctuaries. You see up there is that in focus, Gina? It looks a little fuzzy, but the Stone Barn Farm, your handsome Stone Barn Farm over at Allen's Pond. Daniel Webster, that's Skunknet River there in the top row. Wellfleet Bay, Acadia, and the Boston Nature Center there. That may be as good as it gets. Yeah, that's a little better. Oh yeah, there we go. Okay. This was one of my scorecard as I was doing the sanctuary project. This was actually torn off the back of one of the sanctuary magazines. But you see those concentric circles there that I've imposed on the map. Those center on the town of Princeton, which is where I live, and that's also the center of the universe. So you see, a lot of the sanctuaries were an easy day trip from where I lived. I could leave in the morning and be back to my studio in the evening. But some of the outlying sanctuaries where I did get overnight accommodations. I would stay with volunteers or hire a hotel room or something like that. But you can see I had these 57 sanctuaries, and I had to keep track of which ones I was visiting, and also what season would be best for me to visit the various different sanctuaries, and weather, I had to take into account weather considerations and so forth. I also would get a sanctuary map for the sanctuary I was about to visit, and just study the map and see what special points of interest were on that sanctuary, things I might want to target once I got to that location. This is the field kit that I carried on all of my sanctuary visits. This is a watercolor field kit. Many field artists use watercolor. It's the easiest full color medium to carry into the field and use. It's not necessarily the easiest, but it is the most compact and the easiest to take along into the field. Everything you see here in this kit here fits into this pack chair here at the bottom. That's also a backpack. It's a stool and a backpack. And everything except for this tripod-mounted telescope fits into that backpack. Now, when I first started the project, I thought maybe I would do all of the artwork for the project on location at these various sanctuaries. I thought, I'll go to a sanctuary and I'll do a watercolor. Maybe if I have time, maybe I'll do 2. If I'm having a really good day, maybe 3. Well, as it turned out, I was seeing so many things that I wanted to record at the various different sanctuaries that I found that too limiting. I did quite a bit of the work on location, but I also did work back in my studio as a follow-up to these sanctuary visits. So I wanted to start out with some of the ones that I did right on location at the sanctuaries. Well, plants are good models for field artists. Birds, as you know, can fly, and plants cannot. So they're very good models. I could take my time with botanical studies. I did a lot of plants for the project. This is Hepatica up at Wachusett Meadow Wildlife Sanctuary. I was looking at the different the colors of the various plants. There was, in one little colony of hepatica, quite a wide range of colors. You'll also notice with hepatica blossoms that the number of petals varies from blossom to blossom. It's the kind of things you have to notice when you're drawing or painting these things. When I get into actually working with animals, then I would often use a telescope. I've got a telescope with an offset eyepiece. You can see I'm not looking straight through the barrel of the telescope. And that's a particularly good configuration for an artist. Your head is in a downward situation, so you're looking back and forth between what you see in the telescope and what you're working with on your work surface. I can use my telescope in a standing position or a sitting position, so that was an essential tool. Something like a bird on a nest is a wonderful subject for a bird artist. You can depend on a bird on a nest. They're going to be there. If they go away, they'll come right back. So birds on a nest were always something I was on the lookout for. This is up at Rocky Hill in Groton, where there's an elevated view of a heron colony you can see from a high rocky bluff. And it was nice because the day I was there, it was quite windy, and the herons were hunkered right down on the nests. And if you were on the ground level, you wouldn't even know there were birds in the nest. But from this high view, I could see even slightly downward into some of the nests, which was nice. All of the landscapes that I did for the book were done on location. There again, landscapes are a subject that you can take your time with. They don't move rapidly or fly the way other subjects do. So I often also brought with me a watercolor easel. This here that you see is a watercolor easel. And one more piece of equipment to carry, so I didn't always carry that along. But you probably recognize this view over maybe at Great Neck and Wareham. I bet a lot of you have been over to Wareham to see this lovely property. One thing that you need to be careful of when working on location for a landscape is not to have your work surface directly in the sunlight. When you're working on a white sheet of paper, as you do with watercolor, the paper surface is very, very bright, and it's very easy to misjudge the values, the darks and lights in your painting. I've done paintings with my paper in full sunlight, and then you bring them indoors, and they look very dark. So that's something you need to compensate for when you're out doing this work. And often I'm trying to figure out how I can sit in the shade while I'm painting a certain subject that's in the sun. I started out with this one. This is at Drumlin Farm, right, Drumlin Farm in Lincoln. And I started out sitting on that rock up there, which was completely in the shade. And then the sun came around, and I had to move back under the trees to continue working in the shade on this one. This is a view of the community-supported agriculture operation there at Drumlin Farm. You actually can see some people in this painting. There isn't people in very many of the paintings I did for the Sanctuary Project. But they give tours of the CSA, and every now and then a little tractor would come down this track, and they'd let the people off, and they'd have a little program down there and go back. One thing you'll notice here is all the greens. If you live in New England and you're a landscape painter, you have to know how to handle greens. In the summertime, especially away from the coast, inland, it can be green in every direction that you're looking. And that can sometimes, seem a little monotonous, but I've learned to sort of embrace that. I have no green pigments on my palette, and I mix all of my greens from various combinations of yellows and blues. So I really pay attention to the temperature of the greens. Are they warm? Are they cool? And you can see, I think, the variety of greens that I'm working with in a scene like this. I push the variations in green when I'm looking at a landscape to bring out these differences. Another thing I'm doing when I'm working on location with a landscape is I'm really thinking about what am I going to put into my picture and what can I leave out. And that's probably the more important thing. What can I leave out? I call this pictorial editing. And in this situation, I took a photograph of the scene I was painting. You can see it here on the left. This was a very, very steep drop-off into a canyon in Barre, Massachusetts, on the Cooks Canyon Sanctuary. And you can see the changes I've made in my painting. Well, you can see I got rid of all this foliage here. That wasn't really going to do me much good. I emphasized these rocks They're here. You can see I've made those larger and more prominent. And then a major thing I've done, you can see, is I've reduced the tone of the background beyond this cliff edge, so that the cliff edge comes out very strongly, and you really get a sense that you've got this real drop-off here, a very dramatic edge. So those are just some of the things it's something that you need to intuitively train yourself to do, is to figure out what's important, what do I want to put in, and what do I want to leave out. And sometimes I would start a painting and the weather or conditions would change, so I wouldn't be able to finish on location. And that was the case here at down in Barnstable. I was there early one morning on a summer day. It was going to be a hot day. It got up into the 90s that day. But I was there early in the morning on this salt marsh, and the humidity was just incredible. I mean, it was just the humidity was just dripping. Well, I started my first washes, and you can see them up here, and they just sat there. Nothing dried. Those wet washes just sat on that sheet. And part of my process, and the process of many watercolor artists, is to allow those first washes to dry, and then you put additional washes of color on top of those washes. That's called glazing in watercolor painting. Well, I couldn't do any glazing. I was literally stalled because nothing was drying. So I waited for a while and waited, and finally I put it on a bush in the sun and wandered down to the marsh, and I got involved in doing a little flea bane down on the marsh. So by the time I got back, the light had changed. I did take some digital photographs when I first started, so I did have a backup. But often, a start like this, just to get a good start in the field, is something you need back in the studio. In the first place, it establishes the design of the picture, but also you sort of set the tone of the palette, the colors that you choose in those early stages. And those starts can lead you on when you get back to the studio to finish the picture. So I would say a good start is better than rushing things, and or trying to, some artists refer to chasing the light, where the light changes and they go, oh, I like that even better. Well, if you're an oil painter, that's fine. You can sort of, you can paint over what you've done, but with watercolor, you really can't do that. You've got to sort of take a straight path and finish it the way you had started. I was also keeping sketchbooks as I was doing each visit, especially with small active birds. That's the way I start, is by just watching them intently and doing a number of different sketches of the bird in various different poses. I also use my sketchbook to plan some of the watercolor paintings. I do what artists call a thumbnail sketch in the watercolor, and that sketch is only about, maybe 5 inches across or even less. And that establishes the main elements in the picture, where I'm going to place the horizon, that type of thing. I work out those problems, so when I get onto my piece of final watercolor paper, I'm not faced with all those kinds of decisions. I can get right down to the drawing and the painting. So it's a planning tool. Anyone who does a lot of this drawing of nature subjects will tell you the best way to get to know how something is put together is by drawing it. And what I'm doing when I'm drawing these animals in the field is I'm studying their morphology. Morphology is the science of the form and structure of living things. And that's what you're doing as an artist. You're really studying the structure of these organisms. Sometimes these sketches may not go any further, but all the time I'm internalizing this information as I'm drawing these animals over and over again and seeing how they're put together. Here again, some of the pages from my sketchbooks that I think these made it into the book. There's a lot of field sketches in the book, but a lot of sketches didn't. They were simply my way of exploring the natural world. My sketchbooks are really my way of doing that. I would sometimes take figures right from my sketchbooks and use them in the studio to develop a more ambitious and a more complex painting. This was up again at Rocky Hill in Groton. Field sparrow, beautiful little field sparrow, kind of an unusual bird these days, but there was one singing on a power line cut there. And I made some notes about the wither rod stems around it. But you can see this figure. I have used this figure in my final painting. I will take a figure like this, I'll put it on my scanner, I'll make a scan, I may blow it up or reduce it, and then I can trace it onto my watercolor paper. So there's a lot of tools that I can use to use these field sketches in my final work. And the other thing is, people ask me, well, you know, do you use photography a lot? Well, yes, I do use photographs, but doing a field painting on location of these natural subjects is really, you're capturing much more than a split second of time, which is what you're getting in a photograph. You're with the subject for a period of time. You're hearing things. You're maybe seeing the bird go through various behaviors. So you're really taking in a lot more than you can in one split second of time. This was at Sampson's Island, Cotuit, where there's a least tern colony. And I was visiting the colony and working on a bird on a nest. Remember, I told you, birds on a nest, a good opportunity. So I started out with just this incubating bird on a nest, sitting there. I was working with my telescope back behind the ropes, outside the colony itself. And as I was working on the colony, I noticed off to one side was the eggshell, an eggshell from the nest. So I moved that a little bit different, put it in a little different position. I did ask a warden later, what do they do with their eggshells? And terns do not move their eggshells. Some other birds, like plovers, I think sometimes will carry their eggshells and drop them in the ocean, but terns don't do that, he said. So I figured I was okay there. But then as I was working on this bird, it started to sort of move around uncomfortably on the nest, and soon this little chick popped its head out from under the mother bird out in front here. I was still luckily in the drawing stages at this point, so I could erase that, those rocks in the front of the bird, and I could draw that little head in there. So now I'm all these different moments are starting to come together in one picture. And there you see with those three, that compilation of moments that can happen with a field painting. Sometimes, too, I would collect a lot of information that I would bring back into my studio for a finished painting. This is Laughing Brook Sanctuary out in Hampden, Mass. Thornton Burgess, everyone familiar? A lot of people, I remember the Mother West Wind stories, Peter Rabbit and some of these characters. Well, Thornton Burgess lived on this property here, and he had a lot of his stories were based on this little stream that ran through the woods there, which he called Laughing Brook, and that's what the sanctuary is called today. So I was there in late summer. The water was low. I could walk right out into the stream bed there on the little gravelly bars, and I could gaze down into the pools of water. And at this point, I'm just gathering information, what I'm seeing. I especially was taken by these crazy, I'm sure a lot of you are too, these crazy geometric shadows formed by the water striders on the bottom of the stream, and noticing other animals and the fish that were in the stream. I took some photographs as well. Photographs are a good tool for me for recording color, but also recording scale. It's very easy when you get back in the studio and you're combining some of these elements to get the scale out of whack. I've sometimes finished a painting with a bird, and I look at the leaves, and I say, those leaves are way too big for that bird, So the photos are a good way to remind yourself of the scale of the different organisms you're working with. So then I'll take my sketchbook, like I'll say, I made some photocopies, I changed some sizes, and I start doing what I call a working drawing. And I'm cutting up my copies that I make from my sketchbook, I'm moving them around on the sheet, and just trying to figure out, get sort of a nice composition going between these different shapes. And then I'll put that on a light table, and I'll trace that onto a piece of watercolor paper, and continuing with the finished painting. And there's the final painting of the water striders and the black-nosed dace there at Laughing Brook. Sometimes I would go to a sanctuary and I would see something, and it wouldn't occur to me until later, like, late that night I'd get back home or get back to my hotel room, and I'd start thinking, geez, that would make a good subject for a painting. And that's what happened here up at Kettle Island. This is up on the North Shore of Manchester by the sea. I was there in the afternoon. It was late in the year, like early November, and the sun was coming right at me. And these birds flew in. There's a Trustees of Reservations property right there called the Coolidge Reservation, and these birds flew in and they landed on the grass between the ocean and me. And because the light was coming right at them, they were backlit. The birds were backlit. And at the time, this is my sketchbook page up here. And I actually wrote a little bit about that there. I said the birds had a sort of a strong halo around them, artists sometimes call this rim lighting, from this backlit kind of effect. So like I said, later I thought, geez, that would be an interesting idea for a painting. What you see here is a test painting, where I'm working with the shapes that I collected, but I'm just trying out that idea, trying different combinations of color and shape to see if I can get that effect going. And one thing I noticed when I stacked one bird's shape against another, that halo effect came out even more. So I said, well, I'm going to do that even more when I get to my final painting. Well, I did this painting in the studio. So I stopped at intervals while I was painting it, and I made a scan so you can see the stages that I went through to do this painting. This is the first wash that I did. I first had done a pencil drawing, and you'll notice I made sure there was some nice overlaps of one bird to the other. But what I'm painting here is the shadow pattern. I'm painting the shadow pattern. And you're looking at this and you're going, these are white birds, you know, because they do look very dark here, don't they? One thing I've learned when you're using watercolor, the very first washes you put down are against that bright white sheet. And you have to compensate. They're going to look a lot darker than you think. And of course, watercolors dry a little bit lighter also. That's another factor that goes into it. But I've learned that these first washes, you really have to paint them darker than you think you need to. Sometimes I go overboard. And those are the kind of things that keep watercolorists up at night, you know. But so there's the first, this is the second step, and now I've put in the background, the washes in the background grasses, and already I think you can see how those shadow tones don't look quite as dark now, do they? So the last thing to do was to just put the markings on the birds themselves, the collars, the markings on the wings, and so forth. And now I think you really can imagine that these are white birds that are being backlit by that bright early November sun. So these two different types of painting that I'm doing, some on location, some in the studio, they're very different kinds of operations in a lot of ways. And this is how I kind of sum it up. You know, the location work is very sort of intuitive. I'm changing things as I go along. I'm improvising things. Whereas the studio painting can be a slower process, in a way, a more cerebral process where I'm trying different ideas. I can play with the more complex compositions. I can also be more imaginative when I'm working in the studio because I've removed myself from the subject. That British painter, Lucian Freud, he referred to the tyranny of fact, and he was always fighting with that. Some of the paintings I did for these sanctuary parks were quite large. Those were done in the studio. This was the basis for this was a tree, a spruce I had seen, a red spruce I had seen up at the Lake Wampanoag Sanctuary in Gardner. And I didn't see a pileated woodpecker on the tree at the time, but it had these very fresh holes that the pileated woodpecker had made in the tree. And this is my sketchbook. Here you see down here, this is my sketchbook page of the tree that I had observed there at the sanctuary. These drawings here are drawings of a pileated woodpecker that I had done right in our yard or in Princeton, Massachusetts. We have pileateds on a regular basis in Princeton. So I had some reference for that, and I put them together in this finished larger painting in the studio. An even bigger one, in fact, the biggest painting I did for the studio, it kind of crosses the line between a field painting and a studio painting, because what I did was I collected materials, botanical materials. This was up in Endicott in Wenham, I think it was, yep. And it was winter time, and I was collecting a lot of the winter weeds that grew along the drive going in. Now, if you go to a Mass Audubon Sanctuary and if you look at the kiosk there where the trailhead is, it'll usually tell you not to collect the plants. So I was very discreet about that. I made sure I didn't, pick anything that looked like a rare plant. But I did come home with a bunch of these different winter weeds. I actually found out later, I didn't know what this one was in the wintertime. That's purple loosestrife. So I'm sure Mass Audubon was very happy that I removed some of the purple loosestrife from that sanctuary. So just to go back there. So you see, I laid the weeds out. This is on my drawing board in my studio, and I kind of played with them, to get a nice rhythm going. And then one by one, I just rendered each one of these specimens on my big sheet of watercolor paper, which is almost a full sheet of watercolor paper, 22 by 30. There's the final painting. The color doesn't come out very good in this. In fact, this one actually shows a little bit better. You can see there's not a lot of color in winter weeds anyway, but you've got the subtle grays and the browns. Now, you know, this time of year that we're entering right now, of course, is one of the most exciting times for bird watchers and naturalists, because we've got all these birds in migration coming through our area. So this time of year was kind of frustrating for me during the sanctuary period, because I wanted to do every bird I saw. You know, I wanted to do a painting of all these birds. And you know, they don't come through it but once a year in breeding plumage like this. So I really wanted to paint as many of these birds as I could. I couldn't do fully formed birds with backgrounds like you see here for every one of the birds I was working with. So what I did was I bought these sketchbooks that are filled with watercolor paper, and I decided to do a number of just very simple portraits that just focus on the bird themselves, just minimal background. And that's how I was able to depict a few more of these migratory birds at this time of year. So I do have a number of wood warblers here that I did during those springs that I was working on the project. And I think there's probably some really good birders in the crowd here. So shout out the names if you know what these warblers are. Blackburnian, all right. Sometimes people call these fire throats, and everyone can see why they're called that. Redstart, a very common bird, kind of a Halloween color scheme. I have a friend who lived at a woodland edge, and he called me and he said, I have a baby oriole coming to my feeding area. And I realized what he was talking about. It was one of these redstarts.
That was in Westport.
It was in Westport too, yeah, that's right. Chestnut-sided, very aptly named, wouldn't you say? This one's a little less common. I don't see one of these every year. But this is up at Nahant, Marblehead Neck and Nahant. Those are what birders call migrant traps, because these are bodies of what the land is sticking out into the ocean. They're surrounded by water and migration. The birds are migrating up the coast, and they pack into these areas during the daytime and then fly at night. So, bay-breasted warbler. I saw males and females that day that I visited. How about this one? I pushed, good, very good, Nashville. I pushed the color in a little bit. These don't look quite this bright. This is a breeding male Nashville warbler. Magnolia, very good, good crowd.
That's Mike.
All right. I want to talk a little bit about the different bird conservation programs at the different Mass Audubon sanctuaries. Mass Audubon does a lot of this type of work. It can be something very simple, such as just keeping a barn door open in a barn so that barn swallows can come in and out and build their nests on the rafters. This particular barn swallow was right here from Allen's Pond. It was nesting just above the sliding door in the Stone Barn Farm. And then up at Ipswich River, I painted this male bluebird. And if you look closely, he has a ring around his right leg. And they do a banding program there with their bluebirds, so I'm sure this bird was well studied up there at Ipswich River. There are also programs that are a little more intensive, such as Mass Audubon has a program for grassland birds where they have partnered with farmers to get them to adjust their mowing schedule so that they don't destroy the nests and eggs of things like bobolinks. And that has been successful. And I think, David, I heard about that wonderful project that you had at Allen's Pond with the bobolinks and the success you had there, which is great to hear.
It was Fred Thurber gave that.
Fred Thurber, yes. And of course, Allen's Pond again comes into you remember I told you how birds on a nest are something I'm always on the lookout for? Well, right there at Allen's Pond, I found a piping plover on a nest, once again staying behind the ropes and so forth. But I set up the scope on it and was able to finish that painting right on location of the bird on the nest. You know, at Sampson's Island, they do shut down the whole island during the breeding season so that people can't land with their boats. You know, they got wardens out there. that patrol the island to make sure that dogs and people don't disturb the nesting birds. It's usually, as you know, a species of plovers or terns that are the focus of the coastal waterbird programs here in Massachusetts. Other animals also benefit from different Mass Audubon conservation programs out at Wellfleet Bay. I happened to be there when the teams were monitoring the diamondback terrapin nests, and you'd walk around the sanctuary and you'd find enclosures like this in some of the sandy banks around the marsh. And that was an enclosure built there to protect, the volunteers go out after the turtles have laid their eggs, and they identify these spots and build these enclosures. And then they watch them very closely, and when the turtles start to hatch, this team will descend on this nest, and they actually assist the young turtles getting to safe areas before they're picked off by, in this case, it was mostly laughing gulls. There was lots of laughing gulls in the area, always looking for a nice baby turtle for their lunch. So, some of these, especially with the blooming plants, it was a matter of being in the right place at the right time. And there was a fellow named Ron Wolanin, who was the Western Sanctuary Manager for Mass Audubon at that time. And he circulated regularly through these Western sanctuaries. And so I called him and I said, Ron, let me know if something's, something blooming you think I might want to work with. Well, I got a call one night, Sunday night. He said, well, Barry, the yellow lady slippers are in full bloom up at High Ledges, and it's going to be a hot week. You might want to get up there. So right away, the next morning, I did head for High Ledges and saw these yellow lady slippers in the wild. Anyone else seen yellow lady slippers in the wild? They're really stunning, aren't they? They actually do very well in a garden situation, yellow lady slippers. Pink lady slippers don't, but yellow lady slippers can be cultivated. But they don't look the same when they're in the wild in a forest setting like this. Another thing that Ron put me onto were these orchids at the West Mountain Sanctuary in Plainfield. And this wasn't even on a sanctuary trail. He told me to go up this road. It was on the one side of the sanctuary. He said, park it, mailbox number 7, and then you'll see a yellow house, and then just turn to your left. And I turned to my left, and there was a big wet marsh there. And Ron had tied this surveyor's tape, little orange surveyor's tape on these bushes leading out into the marsh. So I pulled on my rubber boots, and sure enough, I got out a beautiful colony of these small purple-fringed orchids that I worked with. So obviously, I did a lot of birds for the project. Birds are sort of my specialty. And also, I was doing this for the Museum of American Bird Art. That was the publisher of the book and the sponsor of my project. So I felt like I could do lots of birds. Common birds. Actually, these common birds are sometimes the more difficult ones to do because we all know what they look like. And I know what they look like. And if I don't get it right, it's obvious right away. It's kind of like doing a drawing or painting of your mother or your wife. If you don't get it right, you know it, right? So these common birds can be a challenge. And then, of course, some of the what birders would call good birds I would encounter. I didn't really encounter any rare birds on the sanctuaries, but that really wasn't my intent anyway. I would have painted it if I seen them. But these were some of the less common birds: a kestrel, Acadia, a young orchard oriole. We're starting to see those more and more. And then a winter wren up at Pleasant Valley in Lenox. Mammals, I worked with mammals. A number of the sanctuaries have working farms. So I could work with the farm animals, which are great models. You don't have to use optics. Obviously, you can walk right up to them and work with them. This is Hickory and Willow, the Shetland sheep at Wachusett Meadow Wildlife Sanctuary. And then, of course, that friendly little chipmunk. Some people aren't too fond of these if they're digging up all the bulbs in your garden. But they are attractive little animals. I worked with reptiles and amphibians. Up at Stony Brook, they've got these lovely boardwalks. You can walk out into these lily ponds, and there's painted turtles everywhere, and the kids love it. The kids are running around and pointing out the turtles. The day I was there, the turtles were holding their legs up in the air. And sometimes all 4 legs, they would lay on their plastron, that's the lower shell, on a stump, and all 4 legs would be in the air. And I asked someone about this later, and they said, well, there was 2 theories. One of them thought they were maybe trying to air it out and give the leeches out that might be on their legs. But I think the more probable thing was that they were trying to expose more of their skin to the sun to increase the basking effect as they were sitting on these stumps. Anyway, we have a very similar pose that we do in my yoga class, where you lay on your belly and you raise the weight. So I call this turtle yoga. And then a little red after I noticed I included a little red maple samara seed to give it some scale. Butterflies were fun to do. I found that some butterflies are quite easy to approach. American ladies are quite easy to approach and to draw. Others, like black swallowtails, you can't get near them. They just seem to know that you're there, and they won't let you get real close. A spring azure up at the Camp Wildwood. That was the only sanctuary or the only Mass Audubon property I went to outside of Massachusetts, up in Rindge, New Hampshire. And dragonflies. Dragonflies are actually quite a good model. Through a telescope, like a flycatcher, they come back to the same perch repeatedly. You know, they'll fly out and catch something and then come back to the same perch. So as long as you leave your scope on that little snag or stump, you'll get the animal coming back. And I could build up a set of sketches like that. Fish, I work with fish also. Fish you need to view from a high viewpoint. If you have any fish watching, reflections can be a problem. But one of my favorite fish is the eastern brook trout, I think one of the loveliest fish. And also pumpkin seed. This was at Eagle Lake right in Holden. There was a dike there with a lot of pumpkin seeds nesting in these sandy nests along the causeway there. And this is probably the first fish you caught with a bobber and worm when you were a kid. But they're lovely fish. They really are very pretty fish. And then flowers. I've already talked about how flowers are great models, because they don't fly away. They stay nice and still for you. And other plants, hobblebush. I love those little buds at the end of each stem that look like a little candle flame at the tip of each branch. Some polypodes at Pleasant Valley. And then landscapes, natural landscapes and cultural landscapes. Rough Meadows in Rowley, so named for the grasses that they used to be harvested for agricultural purposes. We did have the show of all the artwork at the Museum of American Bird Art in 2017. I wasn't quite done with all the sanctuaries at that point. I think I was in the high 40s or so at that point. But at that point, it didn't make sense to stop there. You know, I really decided I wanted to do all the sanctuaries. And it was around that time also that Mass Audubon decided, wouldn't this be nice to put this together into a book? So at that point, I definitely had to go ahead and finish off all of the sanctuaries, which had grown to 61 by that time. So I made sure to do all the sanctuaries to get them all into the book. These are the final numbers. And now it is a book. We've got some at the back of the room. I'd be happy to sign some for you after the program tonight. Now, here's a little quiz for you, okay? Now, I'm not going to show you a blue jay and ask you which sanctuary it's from, okay? There are clues in these pictures that will hopefully give you a clue as to where in the state they were painted, okay? This is a high rocky bluff. It's in the eastern part of the state. And if you were to look, shift your gaze, let me get my pointer here, and look around in this area right here, you would see Gillette Stadium. And I was there on a sort of a rainy day. It was a misty, rainy day. And it looked like a big spaceship sitting there that perched in the hills. And they were just starting to gear up for a game. You could hear the music from the loudspeakers drifting over the hills. This is in Sharon, Massachusetts, at the Moose Hill. Yes, the Moose Hill Sanctuary in Sharon from the bluff overlook. This is a cedar swamp, an Atlantic cedar swamp. Quite an unusual habitat these days in New England, but at one point along the New England coast, there were many, many of these Atlantic cedar swamps. The timber is very highly prized, and they're also excellent places when you cut the trees down to grow cranberries. So there's not very many of these Atlantic cedar stands left on the New England coast. There's some nice ones out on the Cape, but not very many. Anyone? This is a very small Atlantic cedar stand at Skunknet River in Barnstable. Now we got some real mountains in this picture, so if you're thinking out west, you're right. This is out in the extreme southwestern corner of Massachusetts. Lime Kiln Farm, that's right, David. So what you're seeing here are the Taconic Mountains of New York, right here, and these are some of the southern Berkshire Hills coming in from the right there. This is a large grassland area in eastern Massachusetts, and this again is a habitat that's not very common in Massachusetts these days. Grasslands tend to be developed quite easily, and so this is a large grassland in Marshfield, Massachusetts. Daniel Webster, yes, that's right. Daniel Webster Wildlife Sanctuary in the Marshfield. Now this one, I think you can kind of get a sense for these low rolling hills with that, which was in the fall. That's a merlin flying over those hills there. Any guesses? Does it kind of have a familiar look, like kind of like the Scottish moors, maybe? Martha's Vineyard, did I hear someone say Martha's Vineyard? This is where it is. It's called Sacajawea Heathland. And I didn't know how to say this, and the neighbor said, think of it as a sneeze. It's like Sacajawea. So this is Sacajawea Heathlands. I don't know if I'm saying that right, but it'll do. So that's the Sacajawea Heathlands. Here again, we get some mountains in the picture here now. We're looking actually eastward in this picture. This is also in the Berkshires. And this town that you see, that's tucked into the picture here, that's Lenox. That's Lenox, Massachusetts. So this is Pleasant Valley, correct, out in Lenox. And this picture here could be taken almost anywhere. I put it in because this paint was painted at one of the newest addition to the Mass Audubon Sanctuary system. It's in Concord, Massachusetts, on the Concord River. That is Great Meadows National Wildlife Sanctuary, Great Meadows National Wildlife Refuge that you're seeing across the river there. And this is the sanctuary that land was originally owned by William Brewster, who was the first president of the Massachusetts Audubon Society in the 1890s. So I'll let you when I finish, I'll let you do it, because I'm almost done here, David. Yep. So this sanctuary is not yet completely open to the public yet, but they are developing the trails and the signage there. All right, now there's a few birds that you can only find at one Mass Audubon sanctuary out of the sanctuary system. This is a white-eyed vireo. And you guys, I'm sure you know that the one sanctuary where it's found is Allen's Pond. That's right, that's right. That was true at the time. There may be other places now, but remember, I'm talking about just Mass Audubon sanctuaries. And it was only Allen's Pond where you could find breeding white-eyed vireos. And then finally, an eagle, a bald eagle on a nest. And there's only one Mass Audubon sanctuary where you can view a bald eagle on a nest. It's along the Connecticut River, and that's a good clue. It's Acadia Wildlife Sanctuary in East Hampton, where you can see a bald eagle there. Interestingly, there's also a heron colony nearby, and a great horned owl came in and set up a nest in the heron colony. So you had a bald eagle nest, and you had a great horned owl. Well, the herons moved out. They did. They abandoned the site. He said, this is getting a little too touchy here. So there you go. That's my program for this evening, and I'd be happy to answer questions. But you've been a great audience. Thank you for your time. Did you want to say anything about the sanctuary there, the connection to the William Brewster Sanctuary?
Yeah, for those of you who were here for the first night, we talked about the importance of William Brewster and of our local Smith Owen Dexter, the Episcopal minister who was minister in Concord, Massachusetts for 25 years, and William Brewster was one of his parishioners, and Smith Owen Dexter ended up compiling and publishing the two last books that they made out of William Brewster's field notes. And so he spent a lot of time out on this farm and October Farm.
Which is right next to
And I went out there with my son a month ago and saw that view across the Concord River,
Yeah.
and it is just a beautiful spot. So I encourage you all to go visit Brewster's Woods and then come back and visit his minister down here at Westport Point. He'll take you on a tour. Thank you so much, Barry.
Any questions? Yeah,
Ball
sure.
Hill Road goes out to his, the Ball Hill Road.
Yes, that's correct. Yep, that's right. Sir?
Yeah, I've got a technical question.
Sure.
This, certainly the photograph of it is beautiful. I mean, the colors are rich, you obviously used in a way that you would express it. But how do you retain that over time? Because with the various daylight problems that we have with the fading of the actual colors, how do you?
With watercolor pigments, is that what you're asking? Watercolor pigments can fade, and I always glaze every original that I do under what they call conservation glass, and that cuts down the UV rays, striking the surface of the picture. I also tell anyone who buys a watercolor from me, don't hang it on a wall that gets direct sun. Okay, there's lots of most houses have lots of walls that do not get direct sun. So if you can protect it from direct sun, and you use a conservation glass, and you pay attention to the pigments that you use, and there are books which will tell you which pigments are more archival than others and much less, more stable colors. If you take advantage of all those things, watercolors last a good many years. I've been to see the Winslow Homer watercolors owned by the Worcester Art Museum. I went into a back room and they pulled them out, and they look like they were painted yesterday, so it can be done.
I have one other question. These are so beautiful, as large as they are. I mean, they're really kind of at the scale of the room. How large do you personally?
The field paintings, as I mentioned, are fairly small. They're more like 11 by 14 is about the largest that I paint on location. Watercolors get larger. They get harder to do the larger size they are, because there's a certain timing involved in watercolor painting. You've got to get certain effects in watercolor. You have to apply the paint at certain points as the paper is drying back, as it's either wet or damp or drying back. So there's definitely that time element involved. So if I'm doing a large watercolor, to get better control, I'll do the larger watercolors in my studio, and the smaller ones I'll do on location.
How large are they? How large?
The largest one, like I said, the weeds painting there, that was 22 by 30, so that was a full sheet of watercolor painting. Can I see a question over here? Oh,
There is-
yes.
How and when did you start working with watercolors and?
Yeah, I've always enjoyed watercolor painting. In fact, Andrew Wyeth was a big influence in my early years. I grew up in Maine, and there was always Andrew Wyeth posters around, and my parents took me to some of his shows. So I really enjoyed his painting, and also some of the other American watercolorists, John Sargent, Ogden Plesner, some of these other artists too. I enjoyed their books. I am self-taught with painting. I went to school for design, for visual design. I went to Southeastern Massachusetts University, now UMass Dartmouth, okay? And we had excellent courses in color and photography and printmaking. And there was a painting department. There were painters that majored in painting, but I never took a painting class there. I taught myself how to paint with watercolor.
Earlier on, you showed a field sketch that became, how long does it take you to do something that's just kind of getting ready to do the real thing?
You mean the sketch on location? How long would it take?
Yeah.
Well, it's funny because when I'm looking at birds in the field and sketching, I'll actually, I'll work on a bird and it'll be in one position and then it'll shift. So I've got to start another drawing, in my sketchbook page, and then it may shift again and I'll start a third, but then the bird will go back to that original pose that I'd started. So I kind of build the drawings up in stages, especially for, animals like that are constantly moving. And I'm looking to try to catch the most characteristic shapes that will give me something that I can build a painting around in the studio. So a lot of it, and I'll tell you, that was not something that came easy. It was, years of practice getting to the point where I could draw fast enough and efficiently enough to get the shapes down quickly when I was working in the field. Yeah. Yes.
favorite sanctuary?
What is my favorite sanctuary? Well, I had two, actually. One of them was the High Ledges out in Shelburne, where I painted the yellow lady slippers. That's sort of a limey kind of a substance. There's a lot of very interesting wildflowers growing out there. And the other one, and I'm not just saying this because I'm in this area, but Allen's Pond was absolutely one of my favorite sanctuaries. The diversity that I found at Allen's Pond, the landscapes, the variety of birds, that, you know, you can work with the coastal birds, the grassland birds. I really enjoyed that sanctuary. So those are my two favorites of the sanctuary system.
Just to know that, I grew up in Katuitt, and I noticed that one of your paintings
Yes.
was from Katuitt. And, Sanson's Island was right near where I lived, and as a lifeguard in training, we had to swim to the island.
Is that right? But they wouldn't let you get out, they wouldn't let you crawl up onto the beach where the terns were nesting, right? So I went over there with one of the tern wardens, you know, they have these summer interns, and we rode over, and he was very knowledgeable too about just, you know, what stage the piping plovers were in and how old some of the terns were, and yeah, it was great, yeah, to get to know those folks.
Okay, Barry, let me.
All right, very good,
Okay,
thank you,
take it
folks.
I just want to remind you, we have one more session next week. Pamela Lowell will be here to talk about her summer with Osprey, going out on the Westport River with Matt Ciccone and others, and then her paintings that she's done here. And so we hope you'll come to that.